for joining me on TMJ. It's wonderful to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Of course, and just getting right into it, we know with some of the most recent updates, America's refusal to remove its blockade from the Strait of Hormuz. We know once that happened, Iran once again effectively closed the strait, and the traffic now is at a near standstill. With the US blockade still there, would you say that the US is fighting to control the global economy at this point, or is it actually losing control of it?
It's a bizarre policy, this blockade. There was a ceasefire. There could have been negotiations. The Americans added the blockade after the ceasefire really could have gone into effect. What happened, of course, was a ceasefire was agreed. Israel violated it immediately with the bombing of Beirut. Uh, the Iranian side said, we have a deal. Israel has to stop. So they closed the strait, at which point the Americans said, well, we'll blockade the strait if you close the strait. Then the U.S. supposedly prevailed on Israel to stop the bombing of Lebanon. So the Iranians said, okay, we'll open the strait. And then Trump said, well, I'm going to keep the blockade. Nobody could figure out what that was about. Just Trumpian, which means, to my mind, reckless and idiotic. Of course, at some level, he wanted to say, I'm in charge, and Iran has to capitulate to my demands, which Iran is not going to do. So what we have right now is a temporary situation where the strait is closed. The U.S. says it has a blockade, though there are many reports that many ships actually pass by that blockade. It's certainly not 100% in
Yeah.
any way. And the oil prices are very high, well above $100 a barrel again. If this situation continues, they will continue to rise. The world energy shortages and all the related shortages of fertilizer and other petrochemical products will continue to exacerbate. And so the economic crisis will worsen. So there's no solution here. It's not that one is going to outweigh the other. We're in a very unstable period. And if the United States has any sense, it will back off. And if it doesn't have any sense, it will launch new attacks. And if that happens, the crisis will dramatically intensify for everybody because there will be physical destruction of the oil and the gas and the water and the industrial and the transport and the pipeline and the port facilities, which of the region, which would be globally devastating.
Yeah, and we've been seeing lots of report coming out about just how bad things are going to get with not just the strait, but as you mentioned, if things do actually escalate to another phase of military confrontation. I had previously as well a former US Army colonel say, and I'd like your thoughts on whether you think it actually will get this bad, that if we do continue on this trajectory, we could be looking at a recession by June. And he also made the claim that potentially even by a depression by September. If this situation does continue for several weeks and potentially into months, how bad would you say things are really going to get?
Well, a renewed outbreak of war would be potentially cataclysmic for the world because you would not only have a blockage of shipments, but you'd have a physical destruction of the basic industrial supply side and of oil, gas, and petrochemicals. And that would, without question, put the world into an extraordinarily um, serious economic crisis. Output would go down, unemployment would rise, inflation would rise. Uh, we feel it very, very badly, and it would be felt all over the world. of course, with the poorest countries feeling it the most because food security, not only energy security, would be compromised very quickly. So if we go back to a shooting war, it would be terrible, disastrous. And that presumably, I hope that's the reason that Trump has paused. The other theory is that he's paused until more of the U.S. military presence is built up for some deliberate renewed action. God forbid, if that's the real U.S. and Israeli plan, it will wreck the whole world. So we are on that knife edge right now. We're not stably even on the knife edge. Knife edge is a bad place to sit, but day by day, the global economic crisis gradually tightens. The noose around the neck of the world economy tightens. But with an outbreak of war, it would be that would be it. We would all be hanging from this complete disaster. Trump has to understand this game is over. It was a game. It was an attempt to uh, conquer Iran in a day. Uh, Trump thought that what he had done in Venezuela was going to be repeated in Iran, that you would get rid of the leader in Venezuela. That was a kidnapping. In Iran, it was just an outright murder through bombing. But Trump said, and he said it that day basically, I'm going to choose the next leader. This shows how delusional he was going into this, and how Netanyahu had conned Trump into doing this because the Israelis told the Americans, oh, we'll kill the supreme leader, and people will uh, joyously overthrow the government in response, and then we'll be in charge. And that was a con job of the world's uh, most awful con man, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, and it seems as though, echoing what you're saying, Trump seemed to have realized actually very early on, despite hoping that it would be otherwise, that this regime change fantasy would actually happen very quickly and they just walk out with a similar situation as they did with Venezuela. But it didn't happen. And it seems Trump really to save face, he still calls it a regime change. He's like, oh, we actually did accomplish that. We now have different leaders who are there.
Right.
So essentially trying to paint this picture of we attempted it and in some fantasy world, we achieved it. So, on one hand, military force that they implemented, despite inflicting heavy damage, hasn't been able to accomplish much in terms of material goals coming into fruition. So, if we would say wars are now fought, let's say through trade routes and finance, and every all the focus that's now on the economics, what would you say victory for either side at this point really would even look like?
I don't think the U.S. has choke points, either the physical quarantine or blockade or economic through sanctions that can defeat Iran. And by defeat, I mean forcing Iran to accept American terms, or what Trump once called unconditional surrender. The U.S. just doesn't have that power. And while it does have the power to destroy, Iran has retaliatory deterrence, which means that if the U.S. goes ahead with some kind of awful, criminal, destructive attack, Iran will be able to do grave and unacceptable damage throughout the Middle East, including Israel and the Gulf. And that, as we've said, would have global uh, disastrous ramifications. So the United States does not have the power to compel Iran to surrender uh, without causing a global disaster. And I think the American side knows this. Uh, and if Trump were a normal, rational person, uh, this failed escapade would just be ended with some excuse and we'd be done with it. And maybe that still is what's going to happen one way or another. But the fact of the matter is, Trump is not simply a normal person that gambled recklessly. He is mentally unstable, not very smart, uh, extreme narcissist, and sadist, I would say. And so if he kills a lot of people, uh, that is not a big problem for him. And if he is seen to have failed, that is a big problem for him. Of course, to some extent, it's a big problem for any politician. But for Trump, because of his mental condition, it's an even bigger problem. He has a great capacity to redefine things in a delusional way and to say that he's won and to redefine the regime change and whatever he wants. So that's what we're hoping for, that he comes up with some story he can tell himself, he can tell his followers, and he just stops what was a reckless and unwise gamble that failed.
Yeah, and in line with what you're just mentioning and how the US has conducted itself from the start of the war, one thing I know you've also explored is this idea that we could be witnessing the decline of the US empire. Do you think that's what we're starting to witness now?
Well, I think the U.S. empire has reached many limits already. We essentially reached the limits in Afghanistan and in Iraq. You could say that Vietnam should have proven the point decades ago. We reached the limits in Ukraine because the Ukraine war was a war of NATO enlargement that failed. We thought Putin would be pushed over or the uh, Russian economy would be driven into the ground. And so we would get our way in Ukraine and in the South Caucasus. So the US faces many, many limits to its self declared global unipolar uh, status, which it doesn't really have. It faces many real limits, and I think this is yet another one. It's turned out that no, the United States cannot overthrow the government of Iran. It has no way to do that. Uh, I'd say, yes, that's par for the course. Uh, Everything that I've said for years and years is when you're 4% of the world population, when you are one of several superpowers, because I would count Russia and China, and I count India in the same category, when you do not have technological dominance, and when these so called choke points that the US has, whether it's the role of the dollar or ownership of NVIDIA chips or something else, uh, turn out not to really be choke points on the rest of the world. We have limits that we should accept. That's a human condition. No country dominates the world, not the United States, not China, not anyone else. And we should just accept that. And on that basis, we should not have tried to overthrow the government of Iran, period. So, yes, this is a basic limit that we're seeing, and I think that they're scrambling. They don't like this limit. They're looking, what's our trick? What can we do? How do we really end this with victory? But nobody has been able to find the path to an American victory in this. I don't think that's the right aspiration. I want to be clear. But it is what Washington's searching for. And I don't think it exists in the way that they do.
Yeah, and to end on, that note, Professor Sachs, I want to kind of touch on a little bit of a personal experience. I know you've spent decades advising governments and UN leadership on crisis management, global cooperation, and obviously much more. Do you ever feel like the world is moving in that opposite direction of everything you've tried to build? And do you ever lose hope seeing what we're now seeing unfold?
Well, we're in a very fragmented environment right now. The UN looks pitifully weak, for example. The UN, which I have donated my time for a quarter century, looks awful. It doesn't stop the wars.
Yeah.
It seems not to work at all. But I don't regard that as somehow a definitive judgment of where we are right now. I regard it as uh, that we're in a very uh, rapidly changing global environment. And the way I interpret it is that not only have we really reached multipolarity, uh, but we are going to reach the point where even the United States and Europe understand that we have multipolarity. So we reach multipolarity, but not in the American imagination or not in the mind of, I'd say, Washington, uh, which is different from America. The Americans don't want any of this war. People are sick of it, really. They're sick of Israel's wars. They're sick of uh, all of this militarism. They're sick of hearing Donald Trump say we can't afford war and health care, so you're just not going to have health care. Are you kidding? The American people say, no, we don't want war then. We want our health care. So I am not despondent. I'm worried as hell, even in these hours and days, because I don't like or trust this president. But the American people are not demanding America's number one place in the world. They're not. They're just demanding give us our cover our dental bills, cover our drug costs, cover our health care, keep our streets clean, make our cities safe. This is what they want. They don't want these wars. So that's uh, some hope for me. And most of the world, almost all of the world, lacks the hegemonic aspiration. I don't think China wants to run the world. I really don't. I don't think Russia wants to run the world. I don't think India wants to run the world. They don't want to be run by the United States. That's a different matter. So the idea that we could actually cooperate on some more peaceful arrangements, that the UN could not only survive, but come back to really play the role that it should, I believe in that. I'm worried about the very short term Trump doing something unbelievably stupid because he's already done something unbelievably stupid uh, at the end of February and the start of March, which was this whole attack on Iran. You know, he brags, he says, oh, every president before me, all seven presidents, they ducked out, but I did it. Yes, that shows what a fool he is, not what a success story he is. So I'm hoping that some sane, rational people in Washington will say, you know, this was ill advised. This was a bad bet. We're going to stop, and then maybe even in Washington, they'd say, you know what? Maybe it would be better to talk with China. Maybe it would be better to talk with Iran. Maybe it would be better to talk with Russia. Then suddenly the world would look a lot better than it does right now.
Absolutely.